Welcome everybody. Yes, we're very lucky to have Wendy Ratcliff and Phil Minns here with us today to talk, as Adele said, about the 22-27 strategy. So a little bit about our guest speakers. Wendy Ratcliff is one of His Majesty's Inspectors and Principal Officer for Early Education at Ofsted. She originally qualified as an early years practitioner. She's got extensive experience of inspection and regulation across a full range of the early years provisions, including schools as well as settings, early years settings. Her role as Principal Officer for Early Education focuses on Ofsted's Best Start in Life strategic priority and the inspection of early education curriculum, including through the Education Inspection Framework and any changes for the future. Phil has been working in the early years for over 30 years, starting as a teacher. He's been a head teacher, a local authority deputy director, and the CEO of a multi-academy trust. He's a senior His Majesty's Inspector for Early Education. He's an Ofsted specialist in early years and primary education, and he's part of the team who develop and monitor the inspection framework for both schools and for early years. So we have two very experienced and knowledgeable inspectors with us today. They're both going to do a presentation for us to talk about these topics, and also at the end of the session we'll be addressing some questions that people sent in over the last few weeks for them to answer. It will only be those questions that we can answer today. As you can imagine, there's such a lot of topic to go through, and we've got a lot of time, a lot of subjects to cover, so it will just be the questions that were sent in previously. So over to you, Wendy and Phil.
Brilliant, thank you so much.
Morning everyone, I'll just share the slides.
Okay, so thank you everybody, and thank you Adele for inviting us to speak to you today. So in today's session we will touch on Best Start in Life and our strategic priority, which we've got now until 2027. We'll also in the questions towards the end talk about the Area SEND Framework, responding to some of the questions that have been sent in earlier. But what we want to do is focus a lot of our time on actually just going through what happens on an inspection. And then also, one of the things that we have been doing more recently is we have been doing some early years curriculum roadshows with a focus on communication and language. So a really good opportunity for us today for us to provide some of those summary of some of those messages that we've been given as we've been going round the country on those road shows. But to start off, we just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to everybody here today for everything that you do for our youngest children. And you may have heard our Chief Inspector, Amanda Spillman, speaking at various conferences and in the media quite recently, and actually thanking everyone in the sector for their ongoing hard work. We know how challenging the last few years have been, and in July 2022 we published a final report in a series of reports about our findings from inspections relating to the impact of pandemic on children's learning and development. And you can read more about that in those published briefings. But actually just thinking about, some of those challenges there that you're facing, and some of some of our youngest children are not where they would usually be still in their learning and development, and an important time for us to be focusing on that best start in life and the importance of a child's early education. And that's why we've got Best Start in Life as our strategic priority. But we'll come back to that at the end. So what happens on an inspection? So most of you will be familiar, well, you will be familiar with, but you'll know that Ofsted carries out our regular inspections to evaluate the overall quality and standards of the early years provision in line with the principles and requirements of the EYFS, because it's the DfE's EYFS framework that sets the standards for all early years providers in this country. And we know that children learn best when they are healthy, safe and secure, and when their individual needs are met, and when they have positive relationships with those adults caring for them. And I think what's really important for us in terms of our inspection, we inspect in line with those principles and requirements, but our inspections don't go through every single one of those requirements. Our inspectors are charged with finding out what it's like to be a child at your setting with you. So how often do we come and inspect? That's a question we're often asked. When will I have my inspection? And basically the short answer is it will depend. You'll see on this slide that it was back in autumn 2020 that the then Secretary of State wrote to us to outline some changes in our inspection arrangements. And each provider will be re-inspected based on their previous judgment. And once re-inspected, a new inspection window starts. And we look to inspect all providers within a 6-year window. The other question we get asked a lot is, how can I prepare for my inspection? And actually, the answer to this is, do what you know is right for your children, not what you think is right for Ofsted. We don't want anybody in an early years setting doing anything specifically for Ofsted, which creates extra work for them. That's why we've worked hard in recent years to dispel some of those myths about what Ofsted does and doesn't want when we carry out our inspection. So where can you find out more information? Everything that we do on inspection, those main activities that inspectors undertake, are set out in our Early Years Inspection Handbook. And this is the handbook that inspectors use when on inspection. And the biggest change that we've made to our inspection was in September 2019, when we introduced the Education Inspection Framework. And this is where we shifted that focus onto curriculum, really making sure that early education got that feature that it deserves. So have a look at the Early Years Inspection Handbook. That sets out everything that an inspector does. There is no secret guidance, and this will answer your questions. So let's just talk about how it works in practice then. So notification call. These are some of the questions that we get asked about the notification call. I would say use that notification call as that first opportunity to ask any questions that you may have about your inspection. Is the notification call the start of the inspection? No, it's not the start of the inspection. It is that opportunity for those professional relationships to be established, set the scene, find out some context about your setting. And what if the inspector calls and you're in the middle of something? You can actually ask the inspector to call at a later time, or the inspector will actually say, is this a convenient time to call? And there may well be 2 notification calls, because actually it may be better if the inspector calls a bit later. And during that notification call, we're often asked, why do inspectors ask about the children attending my setting? That's very much fact finding, so that the inspector can make the most of their time when they're with you on inspection. So let's now just remind ourselves what the Education Inspection Framework judgments are. So here they are. So we have the quality of education, we have personal development, behaviour and attitudes, and leadership and management. And as I said earlier, it was back in September 2019 when we introduced the Education Inspection Framework. And let's look at what we focus on. Focusing on what matters. Within our inspections, it's important that we focus on what matters. We all know how important a child's early years are, and that children learn more in that period from birth to 5 years old than in any other time in their lives. As I said earlier, inspectors are tasked with finding out what it's like to be a child in their early years setting. What's it like to be a child in your setting? Therefore, we want to find out how you decide what it is that you want your children to learn and why you do what you do for the children in your setting. And then finally, how do you know what you do is effective? We want to find out how you identify what the children in your setting know and can do when they first arrive with you, whether there are any gaps in their learning. These may be as a result of something they missed out on during the pandemic, and then how you decide to fill those gaps. We know that what you do can make all the difference, especially for those children who are struggling. If children are at risk of falling behind the majority, the best time to help them to catch up and keep up in the early years is in the early years. Every child can make progress if they're given that right support. And we will want to find out about that support that you're giving them. We'll also want to find out about your curriculum, but what do we mean by this? Phil, you're going to take over from here, I think.
Okay. When we're thinking about what children are learning, of course, we're thinking about those 7 areas of learning, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those later on. And when we think about gaps and what children can and can't do, particularly when we're thinking about the pandemic, a lot of that has been on the prime areas. You know, a lot of the impact we know providers have told us and what we've seen is that those children who've been most impacted by the pandemic, it's been the prime areas. So those are particular areas that we're interested in. But when we're thinking about the curriculum, this is something that we produced some time ago when we were launching the EIF back in 2019 to talk about what the curriculum was. And the curriculum is simply the way that you plan to get your children from where they are when they arrive with you to where you want them to be by the time they leave. So it's you plan for the progress that they're going to make all the way through. And we would see that as this potentially this slide sets out as 3 I's. So there's the intention, your intended curriculum. You've thought about what you want them to learn, where you want them to get to by the end. Then the implementation of that. How are you actually delivering that to children, so that you want them to be able to put on their own coat by a certain point in their time with you. How are you implementing that? What are you doing to help them to learn how to do that for themselves until they can begin to do it for themselves? How you've got adults helping them to learn how to do that. And then the last thing there is the impact. Now we look at evaluating the impact, but of course you're doing that as well, because you're making those judgments about, well, actually, is what I'm doing working? Are they learning this thing? Can they put on their coat when I want them to? Have they learned it quickly enough, or do I want to do a different way? Am I going to start laying it on the floor and having a different approach? So those 3 parts of the curriculum are the sort of the skeleton, the bones of the curriculum, and then you put all of your decisions on there about how you determine what children will learn and the way that you're going to teach it to them, the way that you're going to break it down into the sort of bite-sized chunks so that they can learn and make progress. The method. Yeah, go on.
Shall I just go through? Yeah, I was just thinking. So in terms of, so that's really helpful breakdown of the curriculum and what we mean by the curriculum. This slide here is kind of, on a visual, what actually the inspection methodology looks like, and those key inspection activities that the inspector will go through on the inspection. So starting with the learning walk. The learning walk around your premises is very much the opportunity for leaders, for you to explain how you organise your early years provision, including the aims and rationale for your EYFS curriculum. Inspectors will discuss with you what and want to find out from you what you intend your children to learn. So thinking about that previous slide, what is it that you want your children to know and be able to do as a result of your curriculum? And then following the learning walk, most of the time that is spent on inspections, inspectors will be observing and having discussions with staff, children, parents, just to find out what that curriculum looks like in action. And then, as Phil said, that third eye, the impact, finding out how successful it is. How have children learnt what you've intended them to?
And perhaps it's worth saying though, Wendy, as well, that often that impact, when we're looking at impact, frequently that's a conversation we're having with you. You know, you're telling us about what you want the children to be able to do. And then often we're having really interesting conversations with you where you're saying, do you know, it's worked well for those children, but there's a group of children over here who it just doesn't seem to be working as well for them. So we're trying this and we're giving them a bit of extra practice at this. And and next year we think we might actually change how we do this. That you know, it's don't think that we're coming in to sort of make those judgments almost removed from you. You're making those judgments all the time. You're deciding if what you do is working, and those are the conversations that we're very interested to have with you.
Absolutely. Things like, for example, you know, in the 2 to 3 year old room, it may be that actually we want to make sure that before our children move into the preschool room, they can all put their coats on independently. And how do you know that that's successful? Because your children are able to put their coats on independently. That's, yeah, they're the types of conversations we'll be having.
Should we move on?
Shall we? Yes.
Yep. Okay.
And let's think about that focus, Phil, that we have on communication and language.
Yeah, so this is part of the work that Wendy talked about earlier on, the roadshows we've been doing recently on communication and language. And it's really just, we sort of take every opportunity we can to emphasize this. And a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about the importance of children's spoken language is, you know, everybody that often in the room agrees with that already. But we think it's very powerful that you hear that coming directly from Ofsted, because you need to know that we think it's important too. So you don't sort of think that what you think is important is different from what Ofsted want to see. And anyway, so I'm going to run through a few slides with you about this. The first thing, just to be clear about, is this, the thing that was put into the revised EYFS in 2021. You know, those improvements that were made and the sort of a bit more clarity around some of the areas of learning, particularly, but that the development of children's spoken language underpins all 7 areas of learning and development. It's why when we're on inspection, we will always look at communication and language, partly because it's fundamental, and as a prime area, it's a fundamental aspect of what children learn, but also because children are learning to talk about and understand other people talking about loads of stuff. And it's inevitably going to be the other areas of learning, you know, whether they are talking about emotions or whether they're talking about the balancing that they're trying to do as they do an outdoor activity, or whether they're talking about the painting that they're engaged in. Whatever it is, there's going to be spoken language, there's going to be language and communication going on. So it's a really good way of us seeing what children are doing and learning in that really important area. Now, when we think about communication and language, this is the educational programme. And obviously, as Wendy said earlier on, we inspect in line with and, you know, against the requirements and expectations set out in the EYFS. So the areas for learning are a key part of what we'll look to inspect. You know, and there's a requirement within the EYFS that children have access to all 7 areas of learning and can make progress in all 7 areas of learning. And the prime, you know, are prime for a reason, aren't they? It's because they're so important. And for our youngest children, it would be the bulk of what they do, those 3 prime areas. But then as children get older, they still have those prime areas. They still need those prime areas, even though the specifics are being added in. And this is the educational program for communication and language. And I've sort of basically just broken it down slightly to fit on a slide, but also you can start to see the sort of almost the sequence or the curriculum that's built into this. You know, children, very young children, babies, will start with those back and forth interactions right from birth. You know, as adults, we'll be trying to make eye contact with those babies, and they'll be learning about doing that with us, and we'll be making noises and they'll be making noises, and that develops into conversations as children then learn vocabulary, and they start to then put those words together in, you know, and they're shouting one word at you to start off with, and then perhaps they're putting 2 together to start communicating more. And then they're continually building that new vocabulary. So that process happens. And then we've got in the second 2, or the last 2 bullets in here, we've got that the importance of the frequent exposure to books and extensive occasions to use and embed new words. That's really, really important. I'll come back to that later on. But then the last one, which is a really important one, and perhaps one of the ones that we don't see as often in the early years as perhaps we should, And we've got a theory about that. But this one is to do with the opportunities that children have becoming comfortable using a range of vocabulary and language structures, particularly as they get that bit older, as they're sort of 3 and 4 year olds. It's really about children having the opportunity to hear more complicated things, to help them understand those more complicated things that they're hearing, and also to say more complicated things. When they're starting to explain to you why they like or don't like something, or having an adult explaining the sequence of events that's going to take place whilst they're making this piece of bread or making a sandwich or something. So they're hearing these more complicated things. We think that sometimes people mistakenly think that actually you sort of leave language and communication behind and you go into literacy, and that sort of language and communication finishes and literacy takes over. And that's one of the reasons why perhaps we don't see this, but that's really not the case. Language and communication is one of those 7 areas of learning that should happen throughout the entire time that a child spends in the early years. So right from birth, right the way up to the end of the reception year. And sometimes what happens is people think that there are advantages of doing some of those literacy bits early, doing phonics before children get into school, for example, or doing some writing, trying to teach children to write some words before they get into school. And actually that's not an advantage for those children. And that's because when you look, now literacy has been very well broken down in the revisions that were made to the EYFS, where you can see reading has been split between comprehension and word recognition, the phonics element, and writing has been split between the transcription, the actual physical writing, and composition. And it's comprehension and composition which are the 2 biggest parts of reading and writing. They're 2 biggest and more complicated parts. The actual transcription side, like learning the phonics, are reasonably straightforward. I say reasonably because they're not easy, but they are the smaller pieces of information to learn. We have a set number of letters that you have to learn to write. We have a set number of sounds that you need to learn to be able to use, whether you're hearing them to understand them when you're listening or reading them or writing them. But actually, the far bigger things that children need to learn, they need to learn what words mean, that comprehension. So that means, and there are thousands of words that we use. We have something like 10,000 words that we would just use routinely in our vocabulary. And children need to know what those words mean, and they need to really know what they mean. They need to have quite a deep understanding of them. And the way they learn those words is by hearing them and using them in a context. And the big part of writing is the composition. It's having something to say, actually. It's composition is what we do, what I'm doing now, isn't it? I'm working out what I want to communicate and I'm saying it to you. And when we come on to writing it, it's the same process, but we're then adding in that thing of recording. But composition, encouraging children to answer questions or come up with their own questions or describe how they feel about things, give their opinions, explain what they want to do next, all of these things, all of that, that's all composition. And that's a really, really important skill and piece of knowledge that children need to be able to write later on. But if we don't give them enough chances when they're young, it's going to become a much more difficult task later on. So it's just worth remembering, if you are sort of feeling the pressure, if you like, to do stuff before children get into school, to do particularly with phonics and writing, just go back to the EYFS and the contents here, because actually those things in composition and comprehension are going to have far more impact in the long run for those children, their ability to read and write, than those sort of early bits of phonics. And we won't, if nurseries, if people are doing phonics before children are in reception, there is no requirement on that. And as we inspect in line with EYFS, it's not that we will come down hard on you, but we're not looking for it. And I suppose the issue that we might have is the question we would have, well, you're doing this phonics work, but actually is that getting in the way of doing this other important work around comprehension and helping children to learn about words and being able to use and understand words and being able to have something to say? So when we look at language and communication, that, what's in the EYFS, you can sort of break it down into these 2 aims, if you like. First of all, it's about helping children to build vocabulary and language structures. So learn about them, learn new ones, learn how to put words together into a short sentence, a more complicated sentence, learn how to, learn what those new words mean, all of that stuff. And then the second part there is the using them, the practicing, that is, the using those new vocabulary, these new words and language structures. And the two ways that children will do that, and that you'll be doing it with them in a setting or as a practitioner, are through the interactions that children have with adults and through stories, rhymes and songs. And when we look at interactions particularly, there are issues of quality and quantity, because we know that some children will arrive with you knowing far more words than other children. There's been many studies that have shown that some children arrive knowing millions more words, sometimes thousands more words, of having heard words millions more times, and that gives them that deeper understanding of more words. They don't know millions more words, they might easily know hundreds more words than other children. And the reason that they've got those words is because people have talked to them, basically. Children who are born into an environment where there is lots of conversation with those children, where adults are actively engaged with the children, and those children enjoy lots of interactions with adults, that's how they learn. They pick up the vocabulary and the words, and they understand what they mean. So a child who's been in that situation since birth will come in with a lot more knowledge than the child who hasn't been in that chatty environment since birth. Now, that doesn't mean that the child who knows more words is more intelligent or has some sort of genetic advantage. It just means they've been lucky. They have had the chance to learn more words than the other child. And so we need to recognize those differences and support that child who doesn't know as many words to learn more. The majority of ways that will happen in a preschool setting, in a nursery, or with a childminder, is through the interactions. Now, we've got a definition of teaching, which we put in our handbook some time ago. And I just want to read you a bit of it, because it does help, I think, to understand more about what those interactions might be, because we talk about teaching as being all sorts of different types of communication, questioning and exploring, supporting children to try new things. There's all sorts of things that children will be doing, and that adults can help them to engage in those interactions. And the other thing that comes into the revised EYFS is this idea of a language-rich environment. And it's really important to recognize that a language-rich environment is not one that has lots of words stuck to the walls. It's not one which has involved an awful lot of printing off and laminating, so that, you've got table, chair, gerbil, man, whatever it is, has got a label on it. That's not a language-rich environment, because those words, the children who are with you will never, whilst they're with you, learn to read those words really in any meaningful way. And also, that's not the point of what they're doing when they're young. What they need to know is what the words mean. They need to be able to hear them in a context and use them in a context. So a language-rich environment in the early years is a chatty environment. It's an environment where the interactions that children have with adults help them to learn new words and practice the words that they know. And there's a really important element to put in there, because a chatty environment could just be seen as a noisy environment, but it's more than that. A chatty environment is an environment where all children have those interactions. Because we know that children who've got a head start in language and communication, the ones who come in already knowing those words, inevitably those are the more confident children. And actually, those are the children who you are most likely to speak to. Not really through any choice of yours, but because they'll be the ones who come up to you and talk to you. They'll be the ones who engage with you, because they know that adults will talk to them if they talk to them. So those are the children who can already do it, who sometimes get most practice. Whereas what we've got to do is look out for those children who don't have that level of confidence, because they haven't had that practice. They're not as used to talking to adults. Perhaps they haven't got the words or the experience, but whatever it is, those are the children who really need to benefit from that language-rich environment. Now, the other part of this, which I talked about and mentioned earlier on, are the stories, rhymes, and songs that you choose to share with children. Now, that thing that I sort of drew out earlier on in the EYFS program of study, that the determination there around the curriculum, that talks about the importance of stories, rhymes and songs. And it's because in that last section in the educational program, it says that children need to have the chance to understand and use more complicated words and more complicated word structures. And that's what books are full of. You think of a good rhyming story, a nice Julia Donaldson, inevitably that's going to have more complicated structures in it, because Julia Donaldson has spent years making sure that that book really hangs together and the words rhyme and they scan. So the structures will be more interesting, and also the words will be more interesting, because as soon as any of you sit down to try and write something that rhymes, you'll know you've got to stretch your vocabulary and choose more interesting words. So if you choose good books, you've got, or a lot of the hard work has been done for you, because people have chosen interesting words and good, more demanding structures. Now, if that's wrapped up in an interesting story, or a fun rhyme or song, then children are going to be learning it and enjoying it at the same time. And also the other thing, when you've got those stories runs, particularly the stories, as you get, your children are getting a little bit older and you're sharing those stories with them, there's also those stories going to be having other things that children will be learning about, whether they're learning about families, family dynamics, about different sorts of families, about relationships, about love, about animals, whatever it is. Those books will also be helping children to learn about understanding the world, about PSED, all sorts of other things. So potentially, the time that you spend with children every day reading them stories or singing rhymes and songs could be the richest bit of learning those children get in the day. It could be absolutely prime time learning. And one of the things that we've been saying on our roadshows is remember that it's prime time, and don't treat it like it's not. Don't use it as a time to change nappies. Don't use it as a sort of holding bay whilst you're getting children ready to go home or tidy up. It is potentially the time in the day when the children can learn the most. So really treat it, in that way. And also just bear in mind that you want children to be interested in stories and to want to come and listen to them. I was thinking, imagine if you were one of those people who really enjoyed Killing Eve, the TV series. You've watched the first 2 series of it, and the 3rd series is starting tonight. Okay, 7 o'clock. You're looking forward to it. You're ready. You've got a cup of tea. You've got your Kit Kat, and you are there, ready. And as soon as the credits start and that whole program starts, someone taps you on the shoulder and tells you you've got to go and do a wee. It's going to break your enjoyment, isn't it? It's going to break your concentration in that program. And sometimes that's what we're doing to children. We've got them down, we want them to enjoy this story, and then we're taking them off to go and do something else. And the other thing to bear in mind is, I said we really want all of our children to enjoy stories. And it is really important. And that's not because we want them all to go on and study literature and read Jane Eyre or Shakespeare or something. That's not why we want them to love stories. We need all of those young children to love stories to help them get through the difficult time of learning to read, because it gives them the prize. If they love stories, if they enjoy stories, then learning to read will be the thing that enables them to read them for themselves. So there's a gift, a prize in there that they'll persevere. They're more likely to persevere learning to read because they want to be able to do it for themselves. In exactly the same way that nobody as an adult does driving lessons because they want to do driving lessons. We do driving lessons because we want the opportunities and the freedom that comes with driving. So we keep our eye on the prize and we carry on with lots of expensive lessons, and we might have 2 or 3 tests, but we keep on going because of the prize that's there for them. And we need children to have that same prize in reading, because reading is fundamental. If children can learn to read early, if they can become fluent readers by the time they're sort of, 8 years old, their path through education is so much easier for them. All sorts of things are opened up. The risk of having difficulties through school is reduced, because they've got those skills they need to be able to access all the information that's going on around them. And reading is a long-term issue around social justice. It's being able to read and just pick up the information that's going on around them enables adults to engage in the world. We can see a direct link between the level of vocabulary that children have when they're young and their lifetime success, if you like. We can see that a child with a limited vocabulary when they're about 4, they're far less likely to do well in any of the school assessments. So, whether that's SATs in the end of year at primary school or GCSEs. But those children are over twice as likely to be unemployed by the time they're 34. And that's because the vocabulary that children have when they are that young is the thing that enables them to become good readers. And it's the reading that carries them through education and enables them to have all those other opportunities that we want them to have. So, we can't underestimate how important actually stories, rhymes, and songs are. And the thing, sorry, I might be going on too long here. Someone will have to wave at me if I'm talking on too long. But it's worth also remembering that when those children are in front of you on their first day with you, some of those children will have a strong association of books and love, okay? Because from a very early age, somebody that they care about a lot has cuddled them and shared a book with them, okay? So those children will come in with a view of books and stories particularly, which is incredibly positive, because they've had an advantage as a little child that they've learned that books are good, books are valuable, books are enjoyable, books are about love. So those children are the ones who will be interested in books straight away. Other children, just because they haven't enjoyed the same advantage, they haven't been as lucky, so through no fault of their own, won't have that at all. And the books, they might ignore the books. They might not have anything to do with books. And in that case, you can't treat those two children just the same. You can't expect all those two children to come and sit in front of you and enjoy a book at the same level, because one of them has got so much more knowledge about books than the other. But what you need to do is give that other child that knowledge. So you might need to think differently for that child who hasn't got the knowledge of books. You might need to think about starting them off with smaller things for shorter periods of time, perhaps more of a one-to-one or small group type activity to get them to start to enjoy it, seeing it as a special time and working up to them actually being part of a larger group who can enjoy a story. It's worth remembering just how, if you think about how important enjoying books is for those children, because it really is a life-changing thing. It's really life-changing. So then what we need to do is think about what that looks like when you're dealing with that 2-year-old who perhaps hasn't come across books very much, compared to the 2-year-old who's really familiar with books and has already got some favorites. We need to remember that those children are very, very different from each other. So we need to treat them differently. This is a sort of message that we give whenever we're doing the roadshows at Communication and Language and other ones as well, is we're always trying to get people to spend less time worrying about the activities, because what we see a lot of times is people really spending a long time working on the activity, but not necessarily thinking about what they want children to learn. And this is the classic thing. The reason we put a picture of the mud kitchen here is because, so for example, we'll hear, oh, Ofsted like mud kitchens. Or we'll hear that Ofsted don't like mud kitchens, or that Ofsted like forest school, or Ofsted don't like forest school. And the simple truth is that we really we're rather ambivalent, I suppose. We don't really care. I mean, that sounds a bit harsh, but because it's not the mud kitchen's fault, or it's not about the forest school, it's what happens there. So we could go into one setting and, we could go into 2 settings with exactly the same mud kitchen. One setting, the mud kitchen could be a thriving place where children learn fantastically large amounts of stuff. And we could go into another place where the mud kitchen, nobody learns anything. And because, like I said, it's not the mud kitchen's fault, is that the mud kitchen on its own doesn't teach anybody anything. The difference is the adults. The difference is the adults and their interactions with children. Whether they've said to the children before they go into the mud kitchen, today I really want you to do this, or I want you to make this, or I want you to practice that. Or if you've got an adult in the mud kitchen saying, what are you doing? And describing and, extending children's vocabulary and talking about everything that's going on. So it's not the activity or the resource that makes the difference. It's the person. Often it's the interaction that makes the difference. And one of the reasons that we talk about, activities not being enough is because if you spend a long time thinking about the activity, then the learning isn't necessarily clear. Whereas if you start by thinking, well, what do I want my children to learn? Then you think about the activity. That makes it much easier. So I'll give you an example. I was in a nursery class in a school a few years ago, and the teacher explained to me the activity I was going to see was for children who were struggling with cutting. They were struggling to use a pair of scissors and cut. And these were 3-year-olds. And you can imagine the scenario, those children, when they were trying to cut, their elbows were in the air. They were using the scissors sideways. They were all, and they were doing that chasing round thing where they were sort of following the paper as they traveled around. And so I went to watch this activity, and it was, they were actually making masks out of paper plates for Chinese New Year. And I watched this activity that the children were doing, and their cutting, I think, actually got worse during that activity. The activity had so many different things going on. So children were supposed to be learning a bit about Chinese New Year. They were supposed to be learning some of the sort of craft type skills of being able to put a mask together. A lot of it was actually about follow the instructions of the adult, putting the eyes in the right place and putting things in the right place. Those children's cutting, I think, got worse because nobody helped them to improve it. So they almost sort of reinforced their own bad cutting. And the reason they couldn't cut was because nobody had taught them how to do it, really. Children aren't born with the cutting gene, knowing how to use a pair of scissors. Children who come in being able to use a pair of scissors, somebody's shown them how to do it, basically. It's a tool that they've had to teach. And so looking at that activity, which was, a good 25 minutes, 25, 30 minutes, if you think you want those children to learn how to practice cutting, then actually in 10 minutes, where you simply show them, bring your shoulder, your elbow down. Let me put my hands over the top and I'll show you how to use the scissors. So I'll show you quickly. Now, here are some big pieces of paper. Can you cut them up? That sort of 5-10 minute activity probably would have taught those children far more about the thing that they needed to learn from that than actually what I saw for this sort of extended period of time. And that's sometimes what happens is the learning can get lost in the activity. Have I got time for this, Wendy? Am I still on? Yep. Okay. So
I think you have, Phil. Yes.
Okay, because I can
helpful.
Go. Okay, sometimes I can spend too long going on about stuff because I find it interesting, but I will carry on. So imagine, bear with me while I tell you a little bit of a story. I want you to imagine that we are standing outside a large supermarket, and we've got 5 3-year-old children with us. Now, this supermarket is empty of people, but it is full of stuff. And we explain to our 3-year-olds that we want them to go into the supermarket. We want them to find bread and eggs, and we want them to bring them back out to us. Okay, so they go in through the entrance, they're going to find the bread and eggs, come out through the exit and bring it back to us. And so we set them off, the doors open, we see them walking up through that corridor, we watch them walking past all the fruit and veg and round the corner, and they disappear from sight, and then we wait. And wait. And after about half an hour, 2 children turn up clutching bread and eggs, and we are very pleased. Of course, we've still got 3 children not with us, but we wait some more time. After about another hour, 2 children come out of those doors. They've not got bread and eggs, but they've made it out, so we are pleased. And the 5th child, we wait some more time, but actually that 5th child never comes out of the supermarket. They're sort of lost to us. Don't worry too much though, because this is not a real supermarket. They're not real children. It's just thinking about activities. Okay, so imagine what I'm trying to get across here is that this supermarket is my activity, and out of this activity, the learning that I want children to get is bread and eggs. Those are the 2 things that they could come out with. But of course, my supermarket is full of stuff. It's full of potential things that they could come out with. They might come out with disposable nappies and an avocado. There's endless possibilities of what they could get out of this supermarket, but I've been very specific about bread and eggs. So let's think about each of those children in turn and think about what has happened to them. The first child that came out clutching bread and eggs, we think has got the learning, or they've come out of this activity with the learning. but actually they haven't, because they've been to this supermarket loads of times before. This is their local supermarket near where their granny lives, and their granny brings them here every single Saturday to do the shopping. And the granny has always said, go and get me that, go and get me that, go and get me the bread, go and get me the eggs. And not only that, but with granny, they've made toast and scrambled eggs on toast and boiled eggs and dippy eggs. And they, this child knows so much about bread and eggs, not just where they are in the supermarket, but also what you do with them. So, and because of course they're familiar with the supermarket, they also know the way in and the way out. So that child knew everything they needed to be able to do this activity. So they haven't learned anything new because they could do it already. Well, actually, they have learned one thing, haven't they? They've learned that this activity is really good. They really enjoyed it, that this works for me because I can do this. I'm successful. So they're feeling great. Now, the second child also came out clutching bread and eggs. And we think that they could look like they've learnt it too. But unfortunately, they haven't. They've never been to this supermarket before. In fact, they've never really been to a supermarket. And they don't actually know what bread really is, or eggs. They've eaten them, but they've not really put those things together with the thing that they've eaten and the thing in the shell or in the box. So actually, they haven't learned anything from this activity, except for one very, very important thing. They went in with their best friend, and their best friend was the one who got the bread and the eggs. And so what they've learned about, how to succeed in this is to stick with their friend, because their friend will help them. But from our point of view as the practitioner or as the teacher, it looks like they've got it, but of course they haven't. But they have, that child has learned a very important lesson for school is, you stay with people who know the answers and they'll help you on the way through. I won't be the only person listening to this today who used that strategy. It does happen, doesn't it? Then we look at the next two children who came out of the supermarket without the bread and the eggs. Now, they have never been to this supermarket before, and they're not really too clear on bread and eggs, but they've been to other supermarkets. And what they've learned about supermarkets is, what they know is that if you just keep on going, you'll get out eventually. They've been to enough different supermarkets to know that you just have to keep going up and down. So they haven't really been able to get the learning out of this, this activity. And the activity for them has felt a bit of a trial, to be honest. They've got to do some stuff to complete it, but they just have to keep on going. And sadly, sometimes children have that view of education as they travel up through school as well, that you just have to sort of stick with it and you'll get out one day. And then the last child had no support really to access any of this. They had not been to supermarkets before. They didn't have somebody to help them. They didn't have any of the knowledge they needed. And so they sort of got halfway through and then they just probably sat down and found something interesting and entertaining. And the learning didn't really touch them. And so, of course, those are the children that we should be most worried about, because they haven't got anything really to help them engage with this. The sort of what I'm trying to get across in this story, in this analogy, I suppose, is the importance of thinking about what children already know and making sure that if we're giving them a reasonably complicated activity, that they can do it. If we genuinely wanted children to be able to do this activity, okay, and don't leave this webinar thinking that Ofsted want you to take 3-year-olds into empty supermarkets, because that's not at all the case. But if we did want them to be able to do this activity, then what we need to do is break it down and turn it into something where all the children can succeed. So we break it down into its parts. So we might decide that this is the activity that we want them to do at the end of this term. By the end of July, we want them to be able to go into this and do this. So what are we going to start with? Let's teach them about bread. Let's get everyone to know about bread. Talk to us about bread. Let's make some bread. Let's eat some bread. Let's make some sandwiches. Let's have some stories about bread. Then we might do eggs. We might have some chickens in it. We might see some eggs being hatched. And we might be cooking with eggs and breaking eggs and boiling eggs and doing a range of things so that children really know those pieces of knowledge. And then we take them to the supermarket. And before we do that, we might have done some stories with them about supermarket. We might have set up a supermarket in the space. And then we take them on the journey to show them where the bread is. And eventually we put all of those things together and get them to do it. But then they're all in the position of being able to do that thing. And they can all have, we can then know that they've all got the knowledge they need to be able to do that and succeed. Rather than sometimes our activities, and that's where if we don't consider what children already know, then if we give all children the same activity, then they all get different things from it. And the children who know the least are the ones who will get the least from it. And we need to change that, because otherwise what will happen is those children who know the least, the children who know the fewest words, or haven't, learnt some of the things about how we behave with other people and how we take turns and things like that, those will stay behind other children. And that's what it looks like at the moment when we look at particularly disadvantaged children, who we can identify from about the age of 2. We can see that children who are disadvantaged are behind other children when they're 2, and the gap between them and other children simply grows. It grows through the early years, so the gap has widened by the end of reception, and it continues to grow and broaden and widen all the way through education. And we want to turn that around, and the way that we can do that really, really early in the early years, because we know how important it is to have this sort of greater focus on communication and language, and also this sort of curriculum thinking can help, because it helps us to start thinking what children can't do, and if we know what they can't do, how can we help them to learn how to do those things that are so important? So when we sort of pulling this back to what I was talking about earlier on about the curriculum, and that's that pathway, that plan that you think about for how you're going to get children to where you want them to be. Oh, and that's, I also ought to talk about planning. Sometimes we hear lots of things about the planning that Ofsted want to see. We talk about planning, but we're talking about the planning that goes on in your head. We're not talking about the piece of paper or the book that you've bought or are using. And when we're in on inspection, we'll be wanting to talk to you about how you're getting your children to where they are. We're not going to expect you to sort of produce files and things. We're much more interested in you explaining it to us. So the curriculum isn't the same as the teaching. The curriculum is what you want children to learn. The teaching, or the pedagogy, the teaching is how you teach it. You want everyone to be able to put their own coat on. Okay, how are you going to do that? So separating those two things out makes it easier to then plan the activities, and to make sure that, and to also increase the likelihood that children get the stuff that you want them to get. The curriculum isn't the same as providing experiences. The danger with experiences, if you think about my supermarket, it was an experience. The danger with experience is that your ability to learn from them depends entirely on the knowledge that you've got. Okay, and to think that we give everyone the same experience isn't really fair. The London Marathon's happening on Saturday. Imagine if we just took a random sample of 40,000 people and said, go and do the marathon. You're all going to do the same thing. We'd have a very wide range of results, wouldn't we? Because not everyone will have had the knowledge and the practice that they need to be able to run a marathon. So those experiences, that we need to think about them. They're not the same as a curriculum. We don't need more and more elaborate or creative activities. And I often see, I think, places on Twitter or Pinterest where people have spent ages thinking about these activities and things. And actually, it's really good that people do it. And I have to say, when I was a reception teacher, I used to do it as well. But actually, if you spend more time thinking about what you want your children to learn, then the activities become easier. And also, sometimes we over-adultize it. Sometimes we think that activities need to be engaging from an adult point of view when they don't. You think about the number of young children, 2-year-olds, who get a reasonably expensive present for their birthday in a big box, and they play with the box. We don't need to have that level of elaborateness for our youngest children. Often they'll be interested and excited by reasonably straightforward things if they've got the adults there helping them and enthusing them. And of course, the curriculum isn't a substitute for knowing what children need to learn and knowing those children either, knowing where they are. So we would say that a curriculum is proactive. It's about thinking about where you want your children to get to by the end of their time with you, or this year, or this room. So you're looking to the future, and then you're working out how you're going to get them there. It's thinking about the sequence. You know, how we, you know, those children who come into you who can't sit down and listen to a story. So, okay, so let's think of that as by the end of this year, they're in my toddler room. They're not coming in now being able to do this thing that I'd like them to do. So I want them to be able to do it by the end. So how am I going to break that down? How am I going to get them there so that by the end they can do this thing that they can't do now? And it might be that I try all sorts of different things, you know, and the sequence that I put that into, I'm sort of turning it into smaller steps so that I can get them to do that thing that I think is important for them. And the last one there is the, you know, is the bold all, which is really important. A curriculum ensures that all children are ready. And when we say all, of course, we mean those children who come in, particularly those children who come in without the same advantages as others, and looking at what they can do and what they need to help them get to the same places as everybody else. Now, when we're on inspection, we talked about impact, and we're looking to see the impact of a curriculum. And one of the things that we changed with the 2019 framework was that the way we looked at progress changed, and we moved away entirely from looking at data. And so now we won't look at school or settings internal data, and that means, you know, particularly in the early years, we're not interested in the photographs and things that are around. For a variety of reasons. One is that we don't want to drive settings and providers to think that they've got to spend ages photographing stuff, or, you know, or taking copious notes and 4 different examples of something to prove that a child can do something, because that takes adults away from working directly with children. But also because what we're interested in is if children can do it, you know. So progress for us, and this is our sort of technical definition, is that learning is defined as an alteration in long-term memory. If nothing's altered, nothing's been learned. You know, when children, or when any of us are learning something new, we learn it when we're first finding out about it, it goes into our short-term memory, and that's where it stays. And if we don't do something to secure it, it will go again. You know, your short-term memory is where you keep all of your short-term stuff, the stuff that you've got to do by the end of the day, your shopping list if you haven't written it down. But we keep that for a very short period of time, and then we lose it because it's only in our short-term memory. If we want children to retain it, we need to move it into their long-term memory. And the way that our brains work for everything, if we want to move something from the short-term to the long-term memory, we need to practice it. We need to revisit it and go over it and over it again. You know, those children with their cutting, if we want them to, I can show them how to do it, and they can do it nicely whilst I'm showing them. But if I want them to actually shift that into their long-term memory so it just becomes automatic, I need to give them lots of chances to cut stuff up. I need to think of lots of different ways. I might need to sit with them and remind them how to do it. I might need to say initially, do you remember yesterday I showed you, what do you have to do with your elbow? And all of those things to help them with it. But then we need to give them that sort of focused practice. And so when we're looking at whether things have been learned or not, when we're on inspection, that's what we're looking at. You know, we're interested to have conversations with adults in the room who explain to us what children could not do before that they can do now. What are you taking them on to do next? And it's one of the joys of inspection when you stand in the corner of the room with an adult who's saying to them, look at them over there, you see they're doing that. Well, they've only just learned to do that, and I'm really pleased because I can see that they're having another go, because we've worked really hard on that, because they've really struggled, you know, whether that's turn taking in a game or remembering to put something away, or, you know, whatever it is. That's how we shift the short term into the long term. We help those children to remember it by practicing it. We talk about, people used to say practice makes perfect, and that's not really useful. What practice does is practice makes permanent. And that's what is really helpful for our children. It's what we do, like counting. You know, you count so many times that the practice of counting makes it permanent so that then we can count. And that's what's so important.
Okay, and I think, Phil, you've kind of covered this in what you were just saying in that last.
Oh, I might have done.
You
mean
have,
I might have
yeah.
run over? Yeah.
But yeah, so I think, yeah, really good reminder there, Phil, and really helpful some of those messages there about you know, the importance of communication and language, and some really helpful examples to help us think about you know, children and their learning. So just on this slide for a moment, just thinking about, as Phil's already said, just that reminder, as inspectors, we are not looking for files full of assessment evidence on individual children. We're more interested in that conversation that we have with you around what is it that the children can do now that they couldn't do before, and where are you taking them next? The other area we look on at inspection as well is just a reminder for you. So if we can go on to the next one, Phil. Okay, so also another important part of our inspection is that focus on identify, help and manage in terms of when we're looking at safeguarding, because obviously creating a positive culture and ethos for safeguarding is an important part of everyday life in a setting. And this is how inspectors will focus on that. They'll be interested to find out how you identify those children who may be at risk of harm, and then how you go about helping them, and then how you manage some of those processes as well and make sure those risks are eliminated. Brilliant, thank you. So, other thing to make you aware of, if you want to find out more information, to kind of like help you with some of those misconceptions about what might or might not happen on an inspection, then we have created this page. And this is Ofsted Inspections, what EY providers and practitioners need to know. Again, on our website, there's some of those commonly asked questions where we've just provided some answers and clarity. We review these pages frequently, so if there is anything there that you think would be worth updates or adding, then please do get in touch with us. Then there is also other information you can find. We've got blogs, there's recent blogs there, one around our priorities for early years. There's also one there about what do I need to do to prepare for my inspection, and answering that question, do nothing for Ofsted. Yeah, and you can subscribe to those pages as well, and we'll make sure you've got these links after this webinar. And then finally, let's come back to where we started and our research and what we're doing through our Best Start in Life strategic priority in terms of that research. Phil, I don't know if you just want to very briefly touch on part one and what comes next.
Yeah, so really brief. We've been doing a research review which follows on the research that we did for our handbook for the 2019 one that we published, and that was backed up by research. That's where the curriculum thinking and the progress and things came from, but that research was overarching for all of the areas that we inspect, from early years right the way up to further education and skills. So what we've been starting to do more recently is a piece of early education research, taking that initial research and looking at it in a bit more detail in the context of the early years. We've published the first part of that in November, and that had some sort of, it was setting the scene quite a lot of it. It talked about the current state of play in the early years sector, and also started to look at some of the bigger issues that sort of cut across all areas of the curriculum. So we looked at play, we looked at direct teaching, we looked at a number of other things. And if you want to look at that, and you do, if you Google Ofsted Early Education Research, it's bound to come up there for you. We're currently working on the second part. There'll be 3 parts altogether. The second part, which will be published later on this academic year, sometime before the summer, looks at the prime areas of learning and sort of pulls some key messages there about the importance of them and what you might want to look at if you're trying to get really sort of high quality in those areas. And then the last one, which will probably come out sometime in the autumn, will be about the 4 specific areas, and looking at each of those in turn to see, what might a practitioner be interested in, or what does the research say about what a high quality curriculum might look like for all of those areas of learning.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wendy,
Okay.
do you want to add anything to that before Phil moves on?
No, that's absolutely fine, because I think we're over to questions now, aren't we?
Yes. Fantastic. Thank you so much, my goodness. I have literally written down so many notes and ideas for further advice pieces we can write with you guys, but this has been great. Thank you so much. We have been inundated, as you can imagine, with questions. So if it's okay with everybody, can we just go straight to some questions? And I'll put it to the panel and you guys can decide who would like to answer, if that's okay. So the first one we had, and this is from a practitioner asking, if there's no deputy manager in the setting, will this impact the Ofsted grade?
I'm happy to take that one as a start off. I think what we need to do there is go back to what I mentioned in the presentation and how we inspect in line with the principles and requirements of the EYFS. And it's you know, and we're charged with finding out what it's like to be a child in the setting. So in essence, the answer is it depends. We don't use the EYFS as a compliance checklist, for example. We look to find out what it's like for a child and that impact that has on their quality of education. And if, say, the deputy is on leave, that's, you know, that's not necessarily going to make a difference. But, you know, depending on what we see on the day and in terms of that quality of education over time, will very much depend on, you know, what it's like to be a child here. And so it very much depends on why or why not there might not be a deputy there on the day. It won't necessarily have an impact, if that makes sense.
Brilliant, thank you. We have got another one which is saying, for a special needs child whose social development is so delayed, do you think, or do you have any advice on how the child can build relationship with other children if they have that delay? I think, Phil, you mentioned a bit on this, I suppose, breaking it down to individual children, but
yeah, I mean, when there are children, you know, one of the things that you'll want from the PSED curriculum, you know, one of the things that'll be in there is you'll want children to be able to have relationship with others and be able to work alongside them, you know, share, team, you know, work together, cooperate, all those sorts of things. And when you've got children who've got particular needs and find those things particularly difficult, what you do is you then break it down into even smaller steps. So you're looking at having that, you still want to be ambitious for them. You still want that child to be able to learn eventually that thing that is complicated for them, you know. So in this case, you know, to build relationships with others. But it might be that you spend more time doing that in a one-to-one or demonstrating it. You might have more time where there's an adult supporting that child to do it. And actually, you know, taking it down, you know, perhaps just not snatching might be the thing that's going to be the key thing at this stage, you know, before you're even thinking about sharing. And so, you know, to be able to work alongside somebody else without taking away what they're using. So it's really, you know, that's where knowing the children very well really helps, because you spend more time with them, you work out what they can do, and then you just work out that very small step for those children that's taking them on that journey towards the place where you want them to get. The importance there is to know where you want them to get, you know, because those children, they can be learning all the time. And so it's just important to have that path. So not just think, well, we'll stop them from doing this thing because they can't do it. It's thinking, okay, well, how can we actually help them to learn the things that they need to be able to do this thing in the longer term?
So just on the follow on from that, so how will these changes, the new Area SEND framework, affect how nurseries will be inspected?
I'll leave that one to you, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, there's no real direct link between the inspection of nurseries and the Area SEND inspection. I mean, we often visit nurseries whilst carrying out an Area SEND inspection.
Oh, I think we might have lost Phil there.
Oh, have we lost Phil there? Okay, I think what Phil was explaining there, that there is no direct link between the Education Inspection Framework and how we inspect early years providers versus our Area SEND inspections. But on Area SEND inspections, inspectors may visit any alternative provision or a nursery, for example, that provides places for early years children if it emerges as something that they want to explore during you know, weeks during that Area SEND inspection.
Brilliant, thank you. Bless you, Wendy. I'm aware that Phil's gone now. So
has he gone? Okay.
I can't see him. And yeah, he's just gone. So he'll hopefully rejoin us shortly, because okay, he was sharing his slides. So one of the questions we have is, how will you be exploring and assessing the gaps in children's holistic development post-COVID?
I think this goes back to what Phil was covering when he was talking in the presentation, actually, and how we use our inspection methodology to get to this. So that learning walk, for example, you know, why this, why now? What is it that you're wanting your children to be able to do, etc. You know, and actually we know, you know, that conversation about actually we know our children are arriving with us in the early years at the moment at age 3, not being able to do X, Y, and Z, which they usually would have been able to do, whether that's about putting their coats on or being a bit more independent, because actually they've spent that time at home and that's being done for them. So actually we recognise that, and actually that's what we want to do, and that's where we want to get our children to. So it really is about having that conversation and knowing your children.
Yeah, brilliant. This next one is no surprise, and I was expecting this one. This has been inundated with questions about the new ratios that has been proposed and being discussed. This is obviously a worry for many of the settings who need to continue training staff and support all the children, including those with SEND, with reduced staff in the rooms, etc. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we recognise, you know, some of those challenges that there are there in terms of recruitment, retention of staff, the workforce, and we touch on some of that in our annual report back in December, and also, you know, we make reference to that in our best start in life part 1, setting the scene, as Phil mentioned earlier. But actually, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about using inspection methodology to get to this. And it's like, there's actually, we don't as inspectors go in and count staff, if that makes sense. And there is already some flexibility within the EYFS to make changes to the usual ratios as long as quality is not impacted. So actually it's for the provider to decide. And, you know, there is some potential forthcoming changes that might help clarify this. But what is important is having that ambitious curriculum for all and thinking about how you organise your staff and the knowledge that your staff have. And it may be helpful as well, Adele, we've just this week on our blog page published a blog all about staff ratios and answering some of those frequently asked questions and how we look at that on inspection.
Brilliant. We'll definitely have a look at that one and publish that and reshare that if that's okay.
Yeah.
Then before I hand over to Gail to ask the next ones, we have a question about what kinds of questions do you ask practitioners who are following the birth to 5 guidance opposed to development matters?
Okay, so again, back to inspection methodology, it's up to providers to decide what they want to use. The only thing that is statutory, of course, is the EYFS, and then, you know, and that sets out, those educational programs set out that framework for the curriculum. And so I guess the skeleton, and then it's completely up to providers to decide how and what they use to help them put the meat on the bones. And whether that's birth to 5 matters or whether that's DfE's non-statutory guidance, yeah, that's completely up to providers. We're interested in those things. We still will be asking those questions. Why this, why now?
Thank you. Gail, would you like to do the next ones?
Yes, sure. What protocol do you have in place to ensure Ofsted inspectors follow the guidelines in the handbook during an inspection?
Yeah, thank you. So I think with that one, inspectors use the Ofsted Inspection Handbook. That's that one that's published. That's that one that's accessible for everybody to have a look at. It sets out the main inspection activities, how they go about reaching judgments, for example. And there are also a range of quality assurance processes in place as well. And I think one of the things to sort of say is, you know, we obviously want our inspections to be of high quality, you know, to be help providers to improve. And if you're unsure of anything that's actually happening whilst that inspection is underway, is ask the inspector. Keep those lines of communication open, and yeah, and just make reference to the handbook.
Thanks, Wendy. Phil's back with us, which is great. Welcome back, Phil. We've also got the link to the blog and the EIF document as well on the email, so that will be sent out to everybody.
Oh, perfect.
Have you noticed any current trends during nursery inspections recently? Have things changed?
I think one of the things that we're really pleased to see is that there is that focus settings are having on stories, rhymes and songs. And the importance, putting that focus on the importance of communication and language. So I don't know if you wanted to say any more about that.
Yeah, I should apologise for falling out. I don't know quite what happened
where
to me.
you went.
Yeah, I know. I don't know. I just disappeared and then struggled to get back in. Yeah, as Wendy says, what we're seeing, I mean, part of it we think is in response to COVID, and people being more aware of the impact, particularly on prime areas of learning. And so we are seeing people are prioritising some of those areas of prime. And particularly, I think we've been pleased to see that increased recognition of the importance of the books and the stories and the rhymes and the songs that are being shared, and just giving them a bit more sort of center stage, if you like. And also, I suppose the other thing that we're also pleased about to start seeing is that the move away from spending a lot of time observing children, and actually a recognition that what those children need, particularly any who might have been affected by COVID, is they need more high quality interactions from adults. They need less observation and more sort of direct contact. So I think that's something else that we're pleased to see.
Thank you. As we know, inspectors will spend most of their time in the rooms. What should we expect inspectors to want to see when speaking with managers? Supervision sheets, any other documents?
Again, I think, back to what we were saying in the presentation, the EY inspection is not a compliance checklist, and the things that we will, we'll have discussions, we do those observations. One of the things I think is important to recognise here is that all inspections will be unique. All inspections are unique because no two places are the same. The inspection handbook sets out what paperwork, for example, an inspector may want to see. They won't be asking to see anything that's not required by the EYFS. And actually, there's only two things in terms of documentation inspectors must see when on inspection. They must check DBS arrangements, making sure all staff have got, and you realise the importance of doing that, and also the arrangements per paediatric first aid as well. And other than that, those particular questions or any documentation that inspectors might ask to see will depend on particular areas of inspection focus. And just because they happen to need to see the register in one setting, they might not need to see it in another. It depends. So I hope that is helpful.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions. What would you expect to see on a child with SEND needs in an inspection? Would you look at evidence of working together with parents? Would you want to talk to the parents? And would you expect the practitioners to know how inclusion funding is being spent and at what level?
Do you want to do that one, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, the quick and easy one to say is we won't be asking about funding and how that's being used. And there's a sort of a bit of an it depends answer to this as well, because you can imagine for some children, we might be identifying a child at the beginning of the inspection, and we might try and speak to their parents. We might be really interested to know the level of support they've got. We can't automatically assume that we can speak to any parent, so we won't be sort of lining those things up necessarily. And sometimes parents are keen and willing to talk to us, and other times parents don't want to talk to us. So, or we can't talk to them because they're actually at work and it's all very complicated. So there's no set thing there that says that if you've got a child who's got this sort of need, or a special need of this sort, that we will do these things. What we are interested in, though, with children with special needs, or like any child who's learning in that setting, is well, what can they do? What have you helped them to learn? Where do you want them to get to next? And basically a lot of what we'll be doing is having a conversation. And often that happens, you know, we will try and identify children beforehand so we can track, you know, a child or find out more detail about a child, but other times we'll just see a child and it'll be one of the things we'll say while we're stood in the corner of the room. We're again saying, well, tell me about them, what's happening here. And you know, on
What's
often
their journey?
yeah, you know, what's and it's where are they in that journey? That's what we're often interested in. You know, what have you identified is the challenge for them? How are you helping them to do that? You know, is it, we won't necessarily ask about parents, but often you'll be telling us that we've been working with parents to do this, or you know, we're trying to get parents to do that. But actually, it's what's happening in the setting that we're really interested in. And you know, where do you want them to get? And do you think it's working? Because we're
What
not,
difference
you know,
are you making?
yeah, you know, that desire to make a difference means that sometimes you'll try things that don't work. It doesn't mean you're not a good place. You know, that's actually a sign of being a good place, isn't it? Is that you're having a go at something that you hope will work, but you're keeping an eye on it. And if it doesn't work, then you're going to try something else. So that's, you know, that's what we're interested in, is what can this child do? How well do you know this child? And where do you want them to get to? What's your ambition for them?
Thank you. It's a really comprehensive answer, Phil. Thank you. Back to recruitment. Are you reporting, is Ofsted reporting on the impact, if any, that the recruitment crisis is having on settings?
I think, again, one of the things I know I've made reference to already, and that's one of the things that as an organisation we've got the ability to do. We can call things out, as it were, and that's exactly what we do in things like our annual report. So the annual report back in December made reference to staffing issues. And also we've reported on some, you know, staff in part 1 of setting the scene, best start in life as well. So that's the type of places where we report on that impact.
Perfect. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else you guys would like to cover?
I think the only thing is just that reminder in terms of, you know, answering that question, what do I need to do to prepare for my inspection? Well, the answer would be, don't do anything because you think it's what Ofsted wants to see. Have the confidence to do what you do every day, and don't do anything different just because the inspector calls.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy and Phil. This has been really great. We've had loads of messages coming through to Gail and myself to say thank you for this session, and this has been great. This will be recorded, and like I said, and be shared with everybody that's registered. And we're now close to almost 600 of people who will be getting this recording. So thank you again for your time as well. You guys have been great. We look forward to having you guys hopefully again in the distant future.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.